welcome to another Energy Nerd Show. Bruce is away, but I am super excited to welcome Elena Gonzalez. Good morning, Elena.
Hi, Jeannie. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
All good, thank you.
Good. So what are you sharing with us today?
So today I want to tell you about Costa Rica's energy Achilles heel. Costa Rica has been sold, and markets itself as a very green country, a very environmentally conscious country. And it is. It is very, in terms of how much all of the countries are doing in terms of climate change, it is doing a lot. But there is one point that really gets at me and many people in the field, that is, the article that came out a few years ago. Costa Rica has been running on 100% renewable energy for 100 days, for 200 days. This is, a little bit of framing to sell a very good job that they're doing, but it's not taking into account transportation and the energy that goes into transportation. And so Costa Rica still relies a lot on fossil fuels for transportation. We don't have, the best transportation. We have heavy reliance on private transportation. A lot of people own their own cars. A lot of people own motorcycles to get around. And that's because public transportation is not very good. We have a lot of buses saturating the streets. We have one old train running from east to west that is now being used for transportation of people. And that's about it, and that's how people get around. Transportation in this graph of carbon emissions associated to the energy subsectors, taken from information from 2015, shows that almost 75% of carbon emissions come from transportation. That's because a lot of people, use their cars and use old buses that are saturating the system. There's a lot of buses that are being used in a very inefficient way. There's not an integrated system of buses. Like, buses just go from the farthest towns of Costa Rica into the capital, and they all meet in the center, in the most congested streets of downtown. And so this is something that Costa Rica really has to work on, and it is included in the National Decarbonization Plan. It is the first point, that they have to address transportation, because otherwise, in terms of energy, they're doing very well. There's still some things that they have to work out in terms of how they do the system, but the system overall is working in terms of the environment.
That is a lot to be concerned about. So when the country claims 100% renewables, that's just for the electricity sector?
That's correct. And that's because it is very social democratic. A lot of the things are nationalized. And so we have what is called the Costa Rican Electricity Institute. And they have, for I think almost 100 years, developed the grid. They have integrated, and they work on developing hydroelectric projects. They're starting to develop wind projects in some areas of Costa Rica, but mostly it's hydroelectric. And so that's what really powers, residential, commercial, industrial consumption. And so we can really say that it's very renewable, but transportation is really off the grid. In the decarbonization plan, they really want to bring that in, developing charging stations for vehicles. But, it's also very complicated, because you want to make people invest in expensive technologies, right? Like, a lot of people, the cars that they have are from 30 years ago, which is also a problem, because those are the biggest polluters in terms of cars, but that's what they can afford. They can't really afford to change their cars every few years. And so it brings really an issue of inequality to the matter, which is very important to me.
But a lot of people do get around on the buses, and it seems like that's kind of a centralized way to reduce a lot of emissions if you could electrify the bus fleet. I mean, they're probably owned by the municipalities, and they can have charging stations that don't have to be every few miles for the passenger cars. Are people talking about that?
Well, actually, the buses are not owned by the municipalities. So buses are given out as concessions to private entities. And so the national government hires these private companies to keep the routes. And so it's more of a private partnership. Because of these concessions and because it is a very important service that has to be provided to the public several years ago, they didn't really renew the concessions in a very straightforward, transparent way. And so there is a lot of issues in how these concessions are being handled. And so there is not a lot of accountability regarding this. I was reading the other day, they are starting to provide loans and funds for companies that want to change their fleet to electric buses. So they're starting to develop things that are going to help in this sense.
Well, incentives are great. And it could be that the privatization could end up being a plus because lots of people would like to see the market work in these ways. And I was in a conversation with the candidate Michelle Wu a couple of months ago. And one of the things she said she was most excited about is electrifying the school bus fleet because over the life of a bus, they would save $100,000 in maintenance and in fuel and just counting everything. They'd save $100,000. So if the buses are private, if the infrastructure can get there and the incentives can give a boost, then honestly, it makes economic sense. And then we can think about the east-west train, right?
Yeah, and it's so interesting, when we start talking about public policy, the things that we can do that don't require heavy investment in infrastructure that would already help the country. So there was a policy about 20 years ago that came through the Legislative Assembly that would modernize the operations of the routes in San Jose. And so they were talking about sectorizing the buses, right? Which would reduce the amount of kilometers traveled by each bus. And so we're talking about having buses that come from the outermost areas of the country to a midpoint. And you would have like hundreds of routes that could do that. And from this midpoint into the city, you would have only one bus that would do the trip. And that would decongest the downtown, reducing the hours of congestion that would reduce carbon emissions and reduce the consumption of fossil fuels because you have less people being standstill in traffic for hours because of the amount of buses that were in the downtown area. And you would have less buses doing all of the routes.
What are the next steps with National Decarbonization Plan, and what are your hopes for what's next?
Well, my hopes certainly are that the government takes it more seriously. There's a lot of peacocking regarding the National Decarbonization Plan, but definitely they have been doing good work. They developed an institution within government that is going to be in charge of tracking and monitoring the situation and coordinating with the different ministries and different public entities, because although it is very small, it has a lot of very complex bureaucracy and government apparatus. But I definitely hope that they'll start working on the easier parts, the ones that are easier to implement, such as these kind of policies that just change, how we mobilize. And certainly, I think it's important that the government itself invests in the infrastructure for public transportation. There was actually a study done by the College of Engineers in Costa Rica about the possibility of a subway. And that was one of my favorite topics. I was so excited. And there was even a politician in the last elections that was really pushing it. He unfortunately didn't make it. But there's people that really believe that there's a possibility for a subway in Costa Rica. And it's just so amazing because it would bring a lot of work within the country. It would bring jobs, it would bring economic prosperity, especially in the coming years that will be so important to reactivate the economy. And mobility is so important in terms of gender equality and inequality in terms of economic inequality, because when you have a mobility infrastructure, a transportation infrastructure that focuses on the capacity of someone being able to afford a car, you are letting a lot of people out that don't have these opportunities. And that really drives a wedge in the development of a country and inequality. I was listening to a YouTuber the other day about the cultural differences between cities such as Amsterdam and cities in the US, and how having an economy that is based on or focuses on private transportation, such as the car, has an impact in a woman's life. If you have to drive yourself and you have to drive your children everywhere, then you become your children's driver, right? And you have to sacrifice a lot of your time to drive them everywhere. And that has a huge impact in your own career and your own development. But when you have a transportation and mobility infrastructure that allows for children and everyone to move freely or in a less dependent way of a car, you have people that are able to grow into independent beings. And so you have communities where you're at peace sending your kids to the park next door because you know that they'll be safe there. And so transportation and mobility are just so important to how we develop as societies and culture.
Well, it sounds like there are a lot of great ideas in there. And to your earlier point about people who own cars can't necessarily replace them every few years, that's certainly an issue here as well. So the focus on public transportation and getting that cleaned up and more robust and usable and efficient, and it really serves everyone. So I'm hopeful, very hopeful, and I hope to return to Costa Rica someday.
Yeah, I hope to be able to return as well.
Yes, yes. Well,
Yeah.
it was really great chatting with you this morning.
Thank you. It was great talking to you too.
Thanks, Elena.
Thank you. Bye.